The Lincoln Public Library stood tall against the dark Boston skyline. I checked my watch as I walked up to the big oak doors, 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes early for my first night shift. This security job paid almost double what I'd made at the mall, which seemed too good to be true for just watching an empty building all night. The job listing had been straightforward. Maintain security from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., make regular patrols, ensure all doors remain locked. Nothing unusual for night security work. I'd done similar jobs through college, though never at a place as old or fancy as this 3-story brick building with its stone decorations and tall windows. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the lobby. The evening cleaning staff were finishing up, and a few librarians gathered their belongings at the circulation desk. The main floor was filled with rows of shelves, reading areas with leather chairs and computer stations, all lit up by warm-looking light fixtures. "Mr. Henderson?" a woman's voice called from behind the circulation desk. I walked over to a middle-aged woman in a dark suit. "That's me, Thomas Henderson. Everyone calls me Tom." "Sarah Miller." She didn't offer her hand. "Night manager. You can call me Sarah." She checked her watch with practiced precision. "You're early. Good. That gives us time to go over procedures." Sarah took me to a small office behind the circulation desk. Inside was a desk with security monitors, a logbook, and a phone. She handed me a set of keys. "This one is for the main doors," she explained, pointing to a large brass key. "This is for the staff entrances. This one opens the basement, though you won't need it. And this is for the supply closets." I nodded, trying to remember each key. Sarah pulled out a sheet of paper from a drawer. "These are the rules for night security at Lincoln. I expect you to follow them without exception." I grabbed the paper. Typed in bold letters across the top was Night Security Protocol, followed by 5 numbered rules. 1. Do not investigate strange noises or disturbances. Complete your rounds as scheduled. 2. Do not acknowledge anyone in the building after closing, even if they appear to be staff. 3. Never open the basement door after midnight, regardless of what you hear. 4. Stay out of the children's section after 9 p.m. 5. Do not engage with, assist, or speak to anyone who asks for help finding materials. I laughed, then looked up to see Sarah's face completely serious. "These seem a little unusual," I said. "Is this some kind of joke the staff plays on new guards?" "This is not a joke, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice flat. "Previous guards who ignored these rules don't work here anymore." The way she said it made me stop laughing right away. There was something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but knowledge. Like she had seen things I couldn't imagine. "The night rounds are marked here," she continued, opening the logbook to show a map of the building with checkpoints circled in red. "Main floor at 9 p.m., second floor at 10, third floor at 11, main floor again at midnight, and so on. Sign the logbook at each checkpoint. The cameras cover most areas, but not all. That's why we need physical checks." She walked me through the building, pointing out emergency exits, alarm systems, and problem areas. The tour ended back at the security desk. "The day staff will arrive at 6 a.m. Your shift ends when they relieve you." Sarah handed me a flashlight. "Power outages happen occasionally. The backup generators only cover emergency lighting." She gathered her coat and bag, preparing to leave. "Any questions, Mr. Henderson?" I held up the rules. "These seem specific. Is there something I should know about this place?" Sarah paused at the door. "Just follow the rules. They're there for your protection." With that, she left, her footsteps carrying across the marble floor until the heavy front door closed behind her. And just like that, I was alone in a massive 3-story library. The first hour passed without incident. I made my initial rounds, checking that the main doors were secure and all windows locked. My footsteps bounced through the empty reading rooms. In the daylight, I imagined these spaces felt welcoming, quiet places for study and reflection. At night, with only half the lights on, the reading rooms felt empty and strange. By 9 p.m., I'd reached the main floor checkpoint. I signed the logbook and continued my patrol. The building made the normal settling sounds of an old structure, creaks and soft groans as the temperature dropped outside. Nothing unusual, but in the empty silence, each noise seemed louder. I tried to laugh off the strange rules. What kind of place needed to tell security guards not to talk to people after hours? Of course, nobody should be here. That was the whole point of having security. And why single out the children's section after 9 p.m.? The second floor checkpoint at 10 p.m. went smoothly. The reference section and study carrels stood empty and orderly. The third floor at 11 p.m. was equally quiet, just special collections and archives all locked behind glass doors. By the time I returned to the main floor for my midnight check, I'd convinced myself the rules were just an odd tradition, maybe left over from some incident years ago that had become policy. That's when the lights blinked. It wasn't dramatic, just a quick dimming, like someone had touched the main switch for a split second. I froze in the middle of the history section, waiting. The light steadied. I heard it then. Footsteps, soft but distinct, on the hardwood floor behind me. They moved slowly, deliberately. I turned, shining my flashlight down the row of shelves. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening. Silence. "Hello," I called, then immediately regretted it. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind. Do not acknowledge anyone in the building after closing. No one answered. I kept walking around, checking off the midnight main floor spot in the logbook. As I walked toward the computer lab for my check, I heard the footsteps start again behind me, keeping up with my pace, but always stopping when I turned. The computer lab was a new part of the library, a room with 20 computers set up in rows. I pushed open the glass door and went inside. A man sat at the far computer, typing away. He had on what looked like an old suit, sitting very straight. The computer screen lit up his face with blue light, but I couldn't see his features clearly. I almost asked what he was doing there and how he got in after hours. I was about to speak when I remembered rule number 2. I made myself look away and finished checking the room like I hadn't seen him. The typing didn't stop. The man didn't turn. I finished my check and left the lab, feeling really nervous. Back at the security desk, I looked at the camera feeds. The computer lab camera showed empty desks, no man typing, nobody at all. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was seeing things, just shadows in a new place. I decided to check the upper floors again, even though they weren't due for another hour. When I passed the children's section on my way to the stairs, I heard a giggle, like a kid playing hide and seek. I checked my watch. 12:40 a.m. Rule 4 popped into my head. Stay out of the children's section after 9 p.m. I kept walking, trying to ignore the quiet laughter that followed me all the way to the stairs. The upper floors were quiet and empty. When I got back to the main level around 1:30 a.m., I thought I'd make some coffee in the staff room. That's when I heard it, scratching, quiet but steady, coming from the basement door at the back of the building. I went closer slowly, coffee forgotten. The scratching got louder as I got closer, starting to sound like fingernails dragging inside the wood. I remembered Rule 3. Never open the basement door after midnight, no matter what you hear. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a soft thump, like something heavy leaning against the door. I backed up, going back to the security desk where I could watch the door on camera. The basement camera showed only a dark stairwell with nothing moving. The rest of the night was tense. I did my rounds without thinking much, staying away from the children's section, ignoring the occasional footsteps that seemed to follow me, and keeping far from the basement door where the scratching started up again now and then. Around 5 a.m., with dawn coming and my shift almost over, I made my final round of the main floor. The library was quiet now. No footsteps, no scratching, no giggling. I started to feel a bit better. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild because of those strange rules in the empty building. I turned a corner into the fiction section and froze. A small girl stood in the middle of the aisle, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing an old-fashioned dress with a white collar. Her dark hair was in neat braids. "Can you help me find a book?" she asked, her voice sweet and clear in the silence. I opened my mouth, then closed it, remembering Rule 5. Do not engage with, assist, or speak to anyone who asks for help finding materials. The girl stepped closer, tilting her head. "Please? I've been looking all night." I took a step back, shaking my head slightly. She smiled then, a wide, stretching smile that went too far across her face, showing too many teeth. I backed away, keeping my eyes on her until I reached the end of the row, then turned and walked quickly toward the security desk. When I looked at the security monitors, the fiction section appeared empty. By the time the morning staff arrived at 6 a.m., I sat at the security desk, exhausted and shaken. Sarah was among the first to enter, giving me a knowing look as she approached. "How was your first night, Mr. Henderson?" she asked. I handed her the logbook with my signed checkpoints. "Fine," I lied. "Quiet." She looked at my face. "You followed the rules, I take it?" That's when it hit me. Every single rule had been tested during my first night. The footsteps, the man in the computer lab, the basement door, the children's section after 9 p.m., the little girl asking for help. "Yes," I said finally. "I followed the rules." Sarah nodded, looking relieved. "Good. That's good. We'll see you tonight then?" It wasn't really a question. I nodded anyway. The pay was too good to walk away from. Besides, I'd survived one night already. How bad could the second night be? I had been working at the Lincoln Public Library for 1 week, and I already knew I wasn't going crazy. After the first night, I told myself the strange occurrences were just my imagination. But 5 more shifts had confirmed everything was real. Too real. I sat at my kitchen table, pen above the journal I'd bought just for this purpose. Starting from my first night, I wrote down every weird thing that happened. The footsteps that followed me, but disappeared when I turned around. The man typing in the computer lab who wasn't on camera footage. The giggling in the children's section after 9 p.m. and the scratching from behind the basement door. That last one bothered me the most. I pressed the pen harder as I described it. The voices sounded really upset. Not like the little girl with her creepy smile or the stiff man at the computer. The basement voices begged for help. They called out in panic. Whatever was down there sounded human and afraid. My phone alarm interrupted my writing. Time to get ready for the evening shift. I closed the journal and put it in my backpack. No way I'd leave this where someone might find it. They'd think I needed serious help. When I arrived at the library just before 8 p.m., I saw Emily, the day librarian, still at the front desk. She looked up from her computer and waved me over. "Tom, how's it going with the night shifts? You look like you haven't slept in days." I thought about the dark circles under my eyes that greeted me in the mirror each morning. "Just adjusting to the schedule," I lied. "Night shifts take some getting used to." Emily tilted her head, concern crossing her face. "Listen, I'm heading out, but do you want to grab coffee tomorrow? I usually hit the cafe across from the public garden around 10 a.m. The offer caught me off guard. "Don't you need to be here during the day?" "I get a late start on Thursdays," she explained. "So, coffee?" I nodded. "Sounds good." After Emily left, Sarah appeared from the staff room for our nightly handoff. "Mr. Henderson," she said with that same formal tone she always used. "Anything to report?" I considered telling her about the voices from the basement, but thought better of it. "Everything's fine," I answered. She looked at me for a bit, then handed me the logbook. "The same rounds as usual. Keep to the schedule." She then packed up and left me alone for the night. After I finished my 9 p.m. rounds, I decided to check the security archive. The desk computer had footage going back several months, and I wanted to see if anyone else had noticed the weird stuff happening here. I looked through the dates until I found entries from 3 months ago when the previous guard was working here. The system showed videos by camera location and date. I clicked on the computer lab footage first. For almost an hour, I watched boring shots of empty rooms. Then I saw him. Michael making his rounds like I did. He walked quickly through the rooms. When he entered the computer lab, he stopped suddenly, just like I did when I saw the typing man. But instead of ignoring him like the rules said, Michael went up to the figure. There wasn't any sound, but I could see Michael talking. The seated man didn't move with his back to the camera. Then Michael reached out and put his hand on the man's shoulder. The room lights blinked on the footage. When they came back on, the typing man was gone. Michael looked confused, spinning around before walking out of the lab. I quickly switched to the hallway camera and saw Michael leaving the lab. He checked his watch, then went toward the main staircase. He started up the steps, then stopped, looking back like someone had called him. He turned and walked back down, heading toward the computer lab again, but he never showed up on any camera after that. I switched between different views, checking the computer lab, the hallway next to it, the main floor. Nothing. Michael had completely disappeared. I sat back in my chair, totally freaked out. The previous guard had broken rule number 2. Do not acknowledge anyone in the building after closing, and he had disappeared because of it. My 10 p.m. round was just going through the motions. I tried to focus on the checkpoints, but I kept thinking about Michael disappearing. Had those things taken him? Is that what happens when you break the rules? When I got back to the security desk, I decided to look through the guard logbook. Maybe Michael had written something weird before he vanished. I flipped back through the pages, past my own entries until I found the last entries from the previous guard. The last entry just said, 11 p.m. round complete. Nothing after that. No hint of trouble, no final message. I was so focused on the logbook that I almost missed it, all the lights getting dimmer throughout the building. I looked up just as every light on the main floor went out, leaving the library completely dark. I grabbed for my flashlight and turned it on. The light showed only a small path ahead of me. This wasn't like the short flicker from my first night. This was a total blackout. The backup generator should have started automatically, but nothing happened. I grabbed my radio from the desk. "This is Henderson. We've got a power outage. Is this affecting the whole building?" No response came back, just static. I tried again with the same result. A loud click came from the back of the building, the distinct sound of a lock turning. I moved my flashlight in that direction, lighting up rows of bookshelves, but nothing else. That's when I heard it, the basement door unlocking itself. I moved my flashlight across the security monitors, but they were all dark now. I was truly alone with whatever was in the library. I took a deep breath and began moving through the main floor, keeping my back to the wall. The narrow beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. I needed to check the circuit breakers in the utility room near the staff entrance. As I moved past the fiction section, I heard something large move in the darkness just beyond my light's reach. A heavy sliding sound, like furniture being moved, followed by the soft pad of footsteps. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead, remembering rule number 2. Don't acknowledge anyone. Don't look. Don't engage. The footsteps circled around me, getting closer, then backing away. I quickened my pace toward the utility room. The air turned cold suddenly, cold enough that my breath fogged in front of my face. I heard whispering coming from multiple directions, not the childish giggling from before, but urgent, overlapping voices too quiet to make out the words. I was halfway to the utility room when I saw her. The little girl stood at the end of a row of shelves, her silhouette visible in my flashlight beam. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her expression was serious, almost adult-like. "You can't ignore us forever," she said, her voice deeper than before, like an adult woman speaking through a child's body. "We've been patient." I kept walking, pretending I hadn't seen or heard her. "The others thought ignoring us would work too," she continued, her voice following me, though I didn't look back. Michael thought that at first. Then he got curious. I reached the utility room door and fumbled with the keys, trying to find the right one by touch. "We're always here, Thomas," she said, using my name for the first time. "Always watching." I got the door open and slipped inside, pulling it closed behind me. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight at the breaker panel. Several switches had flipped. I reset them one by one, and the emergency lights blinked back on, giving the building a dim light. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath. The little girl's words played over in my mind. They knew my name. Had I told any of them my name? I couldn't remember doing so. When I felt better, I opened the door and looked out. The hallway was empty now. I did a quick check of the main floor and saw that the basement door was closed and locked again. The rest of the night was quiet except for some footsteps here and there, and once, a cold hand that brushed against my shoulder during my final check at 5 a.m. When morning came and the lights went back to normal, I did a last check of the building. That's when I saw it, a bloody handprint on the wood of the checkout desk. The red really stood out against the dark surface. Fingers spread wide like someone had slammed their hand down while running past. I backed away, almost tripping over a chair. Should I clean it before the day staff arrived? As I looked around for cleaning supplies, Emily walked through the front door. "Good morning," she called cheerfully. "Still on for coffee later?" I turned back to show her the handprint, but it was gone. The desk surface gleamed clean in the morning light. "Tom, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily set her bag down on the now clean desk. "I'm fine," I managed. "And yes, coffee sounds good. I have some questions about the library's history, if you don't mind." "I love library history talk." Emily smiled. "It's a date then." I grabbed my things and headed for the exit. I was still tired from the night. I pushed open the front door and looked back at the circulation desk where Emily was starting her day. For a second, I thought I saw a shadow standing behind her, tall and really still. I blinked, and it was gone. The daylight hit my face as I stepped outside, much brighter than the library's dim interior. I needed sleep before meeting Emily, but more than that, I needed answers. Why was this happening? What exactly were these entities? And what had happened to Michael? Maybe Emily could fill in some of the historical blanks. Until then, I'd keep documenting everything and following the rules, because now I knew what happened when you didn't. The cafe across from the Boston Public Garden was busy with the mid-morning rush when I arrived. I spotted Emily at a corner table with 2 coffee cups already waiting. "I got you a regular coffee," she said as I sat down. "Wasn't sure how you take it." "Black is perfect," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. Despite getting a few hours of sleep, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. Emily studied my face. "Night shift's really doing a number on you, huh?" I nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "It's an adjustment. Actually, I was hoping you could tell me more about the library. I like knowing the history of places I work." "Sure. What do you want to know?" I decided to start simple. "When was it built?" 1887, Emily answered immediately. "It was part of Boston's expansion of public services. Lincoln was one of the wealthiest benefactors at the time." "What was there before the library?" Emily stirred her coffee. "That's actually pretty dark. The land was used for public executions up until the early 1800s, mostly hangings from what I've read. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Executions? Right where the library stands? Yep, the gallows were supposedly right about where the central reading room is now. After they stopped the executions, the land sat empty for decades. Nobody wanted to build there." She must have noticed my expression because she added, "It sounds morbid, but lots of old Boston buildings are built on some pretty grim history. Has anyone ever..." I searched for a casual way to phrase it. "Has anyone ever died in the library? Or gone missing?" Emily's eyebrows rose. "That's a specific question. There were a couple of heart attacks over the years, old patrons among the stacks, and I think there was a staff member who disappeared sometime in the 90s. The rumor was he just walked out mid-shift and never came back." She leaned forward. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Old buildings, lots of history. I tried to sound casual. Do you ever feel like there's something off about the place? At night, I mean. Emily sat back, a slight frown on her face. Off how? I don't know. Strange noises, weird feelings, that sort of thing. She laughed a bit. All buildings make noise, especially old ones, and working alone at night would make anyone jumpy. She took a sip of her coffee. Though Sarah is still there when you start your shift, right? She's been at Lincoln forever. I swear she looks exactly the same in photos from decades ago. That caught my attention. There are old photos of Sarah around? In the library archives, yeah. Staff photos going way back. Sarah's in a bunch of them from the 50s and 60s. Must be her mom or aunt or something. The resemblance is uncanny. Emily checked her watch. I should head in soon. Any other questions about our spooky old library? I wanted to ask more about Sarah, about the missing staff member from the 90s, about whether Emily had ever encountered anything unusual. But I could see her closing off, her casual curiosity turning to suspicion at my questions. One last thing, I said. The basement. What's down there? Storage mostly. Old furniture, discarded books, holiday decorations, nothing exciting. Emily gathered her purse. Why? Need to go down there for your rounds? I thought about the voices I'd heard, the desperate cries for help. No, just wondering. Emily stood up. Well, this was nice. We should do it again sometime when you're less interested in ghost stories and more interested in getting to know your coworkers. Her tone was light but pointed. Sorry, I said quickly. It's the weird hours messing with me. I'd like to do this again. Her expression softened. Get some sleep, Tom. The library's just a building. Nothing to lose sleep over. As I watched Emily walk away, I couldn't help but think how wrong she was. The Lincoln Public Library was far more than just a building, and whatever it contained had already claimed at least one life that I knew of, and possibly it was coming for mine next. 2 weeks passed since my coffee meeting with Emily, and the library's nightly visitors had become my unwelcome routine. I'd started keeping detailed notes of each encounter, where they appeared, what they did, how they tested the rules. The typed man in the computer lab showed up like clockwork around midnight. The scratching at the basement door grew more insistent around 2 a.m. The child's laughter from the children's section could be heard sometimes close, sometimes distant. But it was the knowledge that the previous guard had disappeared that kept me from sleeping soundly during daylight hours. I needed to know more about the library, about its history, about others who might have vanished like Michael. The Massachusetts Historical Society occupied a brownstone building in Back Bay. Its reading room smelled like old paper and wood polish. I approached the main desk where a gray-haired man sorted through a stack of folders. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm looking for information on the Lincoln Public Library, specifically any incidents or accidents that might have happened there." The man looked up at me through reading glasses. "Public records request? Or personal interest?" "Personal. I work there." He nodded. "I'm Robert Parker, head archivist. Lincoln's an interesting place. Let me see what we have." Robert took me to a research table and went into the stacks. He came back with several boxes and file folders. "This is what we've got on Lincoln. Newspaper clippings, public records, some personal accounts." He set them down with a small thud. "Any specific time period you're interested in? I want to know if people have gone missing there." Robert paused, tilted his head slightly. "Interesting question. Let's start with this." He pulled out a folder labeled Lincoln Library Incidents. The first article dated back to 1903. A librarian named Edward Simmons had vanished during his evening shift. The police report noted that his hat and coat remained at his desk, but he was nowhere to be found. The final entry in the staff log simply read, "Working late in the reference section." "Did they ever find him?" I asked. Robert shook his head. "No, and he wasn't the last." He handed me a timeline he'd compiled. I've been working on a history of Boston's public buildings. Lincoln caught my attention because of the pattern. The timeline documented 12 disappearances between 1903 and 1998. 3 night guards, 4 librarians, 5 patrons who had stayed after hours or been locked in accidentally. All of these people vanished without a trace. Not a single one was ever found, Robert confirmed. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, just gone. He pulled out another article. This one's interesting, 1932. A night guard reported strange occurrences for weeks before he disappeared. His journal was found, but not him. My heart beat faster. His journal. Is it here? No. Property of the library last I checked. Robert studied my face. You seem very invested in this. I chose my words carefully. The building has an unusual atmosphere at night. I'm curious about its history. The land was used for public executions before the library was built, Robert said. Some believe that leaves a mark on a place. You believe that? He smiled thinly. I document history, Mr. Henderson. I don't interpret it. But I will say this. Lincoln has more documented disappearances than any other public building in Boston's history. I thanked Robert and spent the rest of the afternoon photographing articles and making notes. Each disappearance followed a pattern. Night hours, staff or patrons alone, no signs of struggle. The most recent was William Carson, a guard who vanished in 1998. His last log entry, something scratching at the basement door. When I arrived at the library for my shift that evening, I had an hour before Sarah would leave me alone for the night. I needed to use that time to search for the journal Robert had mentioned. Going somewhere? Sarah asked as I walked past the circulation desk. Just checking the building before my rounds, I replied. She watched me with that knowing look I'd come to expect. The encyclopedia section hasn't been used in days. No need to patrol there yet. I nodded and walked away, wondering if her comment was a hint or a warning. The encyclopedia section was in a quiet corner of the main floor, old books arranged on floor-to-ceiling shelves. Nobody consulted printed encyclopedias anymore. They sat untouched, gathering dust. I ran my fingers along the shelves, looking for anything unusual. Near the back wall, I noticed a small gap between the shelving unit and the wall. When I pushed on it, the shelf moved slightly. Behind it was a plain door with no markings. I tried each key on my ring until one clicked in the lock. The door swung open, showing a small room lined with filing cabinets. Dust covered everything, except for a narrow path of footprints that led to the center cabinet. I followed the path and pulled open the middle drawer. Inside were folders labeled by year, going back to the library's opening. I grabbed the folder from 1932, the year Robert had mentioned a guard's journal was found. The folder contained maintenance records, staff logs, and a typed note. Personal effects of Jacob Miller, night guard, found abandoned at security desk, April 14, 1932. Journal placed in historical records. I checked the next drawer and found a section labeled Staff Records, Historical. Inside was a leather-bound book with J. Miller stamped on the cover. Footsteps approached the open door. I stuffed the journal into my jacket and quickly closed the drawers. Sarah stood in the doorway. Find what you were looking for? Just exploring, I said, getting to know the building better. That's sensible, she replied. Knowledge is protection, but some doors are better left closed. She stepped aside. It's almost 8. I'll be leaving soon. Once Sarah was gone, I finished my first round quickly, then went back to the security desk to look at Jacob's journal. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting cramped but readable. The first entries were boring. Building temperatures, maintenance requests, notes about visitors. Then, 3 weeks in, saw a man in the reference section tonight, didn't respond when I called out. When I approached, he vanished. Reported to head librarian, who says this is not unusual. The entries grew increasingly strange. The man appeared again, this time at the card catalog. I watched him for an hour. He never moved, just stood with his back to me. Mr. Williams says to leave him be. Voices from the basement again. They sound like children, but there are no children here at night. We'll investigate tomorrow. Mr. Williams says never to open the basement door after dark. Says it's for my own safety. The man spoke to me tonight. Asked my name. When I told him, he smiled. Never seen teeth like that on a human face. The final entry was short. They know me now. They come every night. Mr. Williams says I've broken the rules. Says I've let them in. Nothing after that. Just blank pages. Jacob Miller had disappeared the next day, according to Robert's records. My rounds continued through the night. Each time I passed the children's section, the giggling grew louder. The man in the computer lab seemed to watch me, even though he never turned around. The scratching at the basement door sounded like multiple hands now, accompanied by muffled voices calling names I couldn't quite make out. Around 2 a.m., I spotted David mopping the main floor. He worked carefully, backing away from the children's section. There was still visible dirt on the floor there. Need some help? I asked, approaching him. David jumped, nearly dropping his mop. Christ, man, don't sneak up on people in this place. Sorry, just noticed you're skipping the children's area. David's face hardened. That's right. And you should too, especially after 9. Why's that? He looked around nervously. You know why. You've been here long enough. David leaned closer, lowering his voice. You've seen them, haven't you? The directness of his question caught me off guard. Seen who? Don't play dumb. The ones who come at night. The ones we pretend aren't there. I looked at his face. David had worked here for years, according to Emily. He'd survived this long, which meant he knew something. The man in the computer lab, I said finally. The little girl. The voices from the basement. David nodded, looking relieved. So you have seen them, and you're still here, which means you're following the rules. He glanced at my hair. So far, anyway. What are they? Why are they here? He went back to mopping, moving us away from the children's section. They're collectors, he said quietly. They take people who acknowledge them, break a rule, and you become part of this place. Not right away, but eventually. Like Michael, the previous guard. David winced. Yeah, like Michael. Like William before him. Like all 12 of them since this place opened. The rules, I said. They've changed over time, haven't they? Jacob's journal from 1932 mentions different instructions. David looked surprised. You found Jacob's journal? Where? Records room behind the encyclopedias. Huh, didn't know about that one. He wrung out his mop. Yeah, the rules change. Every time someone vanishes, we learn something new. Trial and error, you might say. Paid for in blood. Tell me about them, the entities. David sighed, leaning on his mop handle. The man in the computer lab? He was the first. A librarian back in 1903 when the place first opened. Technology was different then. Card catalogs instead of computers. But he's always been about the same thing. Information, progress. He takes the curious ones. And the basement? That's older than the building. Much older. Remember what this land was used for before? Executions, I said, thinking of what Robert and Emily had told me. That's right. Public hanging. All that fear and violence soaks into a place. David shuddered. Whatever's down there feeds on fear. It mimics voices, calls for help. Makes you want to rescue someone. But there's no one to rescue, not anymore. What about the little girl? She's the worst of them. Looks harmless, but she's not. She's the stories. All the dark things people find in books. The thoughts they don't want to admit having. She asks for help finding a book. But what she really wants is to find you. To add you to her collection. The lights blinked suddenly, plunging us into darkness for a second before returning, dimmer than before. David's face went pale. They're listening. They always are. He gathered his cleaning supplies quickly. Word of advice? Never tell them your name. Names have power. Once they know who you are, really know you, that's when they can take you. But why do they want people? What happens to the ones who vanish? Don't know. Don't want to know. David backed away. Just follow the rules. That's all any of us can do. He hurried off toward the staff exit, leaving his floor still half cleaned. I stood alone in the quiet library, processing what he'd told me. 12 people gone without a trace. The entities growing stronger, evolving, adding new rules with each person they took. A soft, cold breath brushed against the back of my neck. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would find. The little girl stood inches behind me, so close I could have reached out and touched her. Her white dress looked bright in the dim light. Her smile stretched too wide, revealing row after row of needle-sharp teeth. "Hello, Thomas," she said, using my name for the second time. "Want to help me find a book?" The little girl stood inches from me with a super-wide smile full of sharp teeth. I tried to stay calm as I remembered David's warning that she was the worst of them all. I kept my face blank, pretending I couldn't see or hear her. I backed away slowly, acting like I was just checking the shelves. The girl's smile dropped. "That's not nice, Thomas. I know you can hear me." I continued backing away, keeping my eyes unfocused. My hand touched the wall behind me as I moved toward the main hall. The girl tilted her head to one side, moving way too quick. "Fine, we have time. Lots and lots of time." She disappeared in a blink. The spot where she had stood was empty. I rushed back to the security desk, my hands shaking as I wrote down everything that happened. What David had told me matched what I'd seen. These things knew me now. They were watching me, learning me. Late October brought cold winds and early darkness. The trees in the public garden were mostly bare now. I'd survived a month at the Lincoln Public Library, but it was getting to me. Each night brought new encounters, each one more aggressive than the last. The computer lab man no longer stayed at his terminal, but walked around the stacks. The giggling from the children's section had grown louder, sounding like many young voices instead of just one. And the scratching at the basement door never stopped. I'd learned to block out the sounds, to ignore the moving shapes out of the corner of my eye, to pretend I didn't notice when books pulled themselves from shelves and floated in the air. The rules kept me safe, even though I wanted to know more about these things and what they really wanted. That night I arrived for my shift to find the library unusually quiet. Sarah handed me the logbook with a worried look. "The basement has been active today," she said. "Stay clear of it, no matter what you hear." I nodded, thinking of Jacob's journal and what he'd written about the basement containing something that predated the building itself. Something connected to the public executions that had once taken place on this land. "I'll check the rest of the building first," I said. Sarah studied my face. "Mr. Henderson, remember the rules. They exist for a reason." After she left, I completed my 9 p.m. round of the main floor, noting that nothing seemed out of place. The usual creaking of the old building was the only sound. When I checked the basement door at 10 p.m., all was quiet. No scratching, no voices. The 11 p.m. and midnight rounds passed without incident. I began to think this might be one of the rare, peaceful nights. Then, at 12:45 a.m. it started. A soft tap against the basement door, then another, then a scrape of what sounded like nails against the wood. I sat at the security desk, watching the basement door on the monitor. The camera showed nothing unusual, just the closed door at the end of the hall. The scratching intensified, becoming frantic. Then I heard a voice. "Hello? Is someone there? Please. Please help me." The voice was male, adult, and terrified, not the childlike voices I'd heard before. "I'm trapped down here," the voice continued. "Please. It's William Carson. I've been down here since '98. William Carson. The name from the historical records. the guard who disappeared in 1998. "Please," the voice begged. "I can't hold on much longer. They'll come back soon. Please open the door." I held the edge of the desk. Rule 3. Never open the basement door after midnight. But what if William was really down there? What if he'd been trapped for 22 years watching guard after guard ignore his pleas for help? "I'm dying," the voice cracked. "Please. I know you can hear me. Just open the door. Let me out before they come back." I tried to focus on my rounds, checking each floor methodically, but when I returned to the main level, the voice had grown more desperate. "They're coming back. Oh God, they're coming back. Please, please." A loud thud hit the door, making it shudder in its frame. Then another. The hinges creaked under the pressure. "Help me!" William's voice screamed, raw with terror. "For God's sake, help me!" I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the basement door. The wood vibrated under my palm as I placed my hand against it. The voice on the other side sobbed. "Please," it whispered. "I'm so scared. I've been alone in the dark for so long." I thought of Michael, the previous guard. Had he heard these same pleas? Had he opened this door and been taken because of it? But what if it really was William? What kind of person would I be if I left him to suffer? The logical part of my brain screamed at me to walk away, to follow the rules, to survive. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave someone in pain when I had the power to help. My hand shook as I took out my keys. Everything went quiet as I slid the key into the lock. "I'm coming," I said, breaking Rule 2 by acknowledging the voice. "Stand back from the door." The scratching stopped. The sobs quieted. I turned the key and pulled the door open a few inches. It was completely dark. No sound, no movement, no sign of William or anyone else. I pushed the door open wider. "William?" Nothing, just silence and darkness so dark that my flashlight didn't help much. Something wasn't right. I felt like I'd made a terrible mistake. I started to back away, to close the door. That's when I saw them. Long, thin fingers wrapping around the edge of the door. Very white, with joints that bent in weird ways. The nails were black and curved like claws. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could. A weird cry came from the other side. Not human, not animal, but something in between. I turned the key, locking whatever it was on the other side. The fingers were still caught in the door, moving and scratching against the wood. Black liquid dripped from where the door had crushed them, making a puddle on the floor at my feet. It smelled like copper and rot. I backed away, watching in horror as the fingers moved, trying to pull free. More black liquid leaked from under the door, spreading across the floor. The weird crying continued, going up and down in a strange way. The lights in the hallway blinked, then got dim. I turned and ran toward the stairs. I needed to get away from whatever was stuck in that door. As I reached the second floor, I saw him. The computer lab man stood at the end of the hallway, blocking my path. Usually he kept his back to me, but now he faced me directly. For the first time I could see his eyes. They caught the dim emergency lighting and looked like an animal's. Yellow-green circles in the darkness. I froze. Rule 2. Do not acknowledge anyone in the building after closing. The man took a step toward me, then another. He moved weirdly, like a puppet. His eyes never blinked. I had nowhere to go. Behind me, the inhuman crying continued from the basement. Ahead of me, the computer lab man walked toward me with his strange walk. I closed my eyes. If I couldn't see him, I couldn't acknowledge him. If I couldn't acknowledge him, he couldn't harm me. That was how the rules worked. With my eyes still closed, I walked forward, directly toward where he stood. It was freezing cold as I passed through where he should have been. The air felt like ice water in my lungs. My skin felt very cold. For a moment, I heard whispers. Lots of voices saying things I couldn't understand. Then I was through. Trying to catch my breath on the other side, I opened my eyes, The hallway behind me was empty. The computer lab man was gone. I spent the rest of the night hiding in the small office behind the circulation desk, listening to the weird cries from the basement slowly change to whimpers, then silence. The black liquid hadn't spread beyond the basement door, but I could still smell its copper rot stench throughout the building. When morning arrived, I checked the basement door. The fingers were gone, but deep scratches marked the wood where they had tried to free themselves. The black liquid had dried up and flaked away when I touched it. I went to the staff bathroom to splash water on my face before the day shift arrived. That's when I saw it in the mirror. White streaks in my hair, starting at my temples and spreading backward. The hair hadn't just changed color. It looked decades older than the rest. Sarah found me still staring at my reflection. "You broke a rule," she said. It wasn't a question. I turned to face her. The basement. Something was trapped in the door. She nodded, her expression unsurprised. "The third rule is perhaps the most important. What's in the basement is older than any of us. Older than the building itself." She reached up and touched her own hair, which I now noticed had similar white streaks running through it. "You're learning the hard way, just like the rest of us." Sarah's words stayed between us. "You're learning the hard way, just like the rest of us." She reached for my hair, almost touching the white streaks that weren't there yesterday. I stepped back, away from her touch. What happened to me? The same thing that happened to me. Sarah turned to leave the bathroom. "Complete your shift, Mr. Henderson. We'll talk another time." 6 weeks had passed since I started working at the Lincoln Public Library. 6 weeks of nightly encounters with entities that shouldn't exist. 6 weeks of following rules designed to keep me alive. The white streaks in my hair had become more pronounced since the night I opened the basement door. A permanent reminder of my mistake. I'd gotten used to seeing them in the mirror each morning. I'd spent the weeks researching everything I could about the library's history. The Historical Society had yielded some information, but not enough. I needed more. Tonight, I arrived early for my shift. The autumn evening had already darkened the sky, bringing early shadows to the library's grand exterior. Inside, the regular patrons were gathering their belongings, preparing to leave before closing. "You're early," Sarah noted from behind the circulation desk. "Wanted to get settled in," I replied. She looked at me with that same knowing expression she always wore, like she could see right through my excuses. "Be careful with your curiosity, Mr. Henderson. It's a valuable trait, until it isn't." Once Sarah left and the building emptied, I began my rounds. The library felt different tonight, quieter somehow. The usual creaks and settling sounds were muted. Even the entities seemed to be holding their breath. After completing my 9 p.m. check, I returned to the security desk. I'd been sitting at this desk for weeks now, monitoring cameras, recording my observations, tracking the entities' movements. But tonight, I looked at the desk itself with new eyes. It was an old piece of furniture, heavy oak with deep drawers on either side. The kind of desk that had been built to last centuries. The surface was worn smooth from decades of use, small scratches and stains marking its history. I ran my fingers along the underside of the desktop. The wood felt uneven in spots, with subtle ridges that didn't match the craftsmanship of the rest of the piece. I pushed against one section that seemed slightly different from the rest. A small click, then silence. I pushed again, harder this time. The wood gave way, sliding back to reveal a hidden compartment I never would have noticed if I hadn't been looking for it. Inside the narrow space was a leather journal, similar to Jacob's but smaller, with no name stamped on the cover. Next to it lay a small metal box. I pulled out both items and placed them on the desk. The journal's leather was cracked with age, its pages yellowed and brittle. The metal box was rusted at the corners but still intact. The first entry in the journal was dated April 20th, 1932, a week after Jacob Miller had disappeared according to the historical records. I found this empty journal in Jacob's desk after they declared him missing. Something happened to him in this place. I aim to find out what, without meeting the same fate. HS. The entries continued, detailing HS's observations during night shifts. Unlike Jacob, this writer seemed more cautious, documenting the entities without engaging them. May 10th, 1932. Saw the man tonight. He stood by the reference desk for hours without moving. When I checked the roster of former employees, I found Edward Simmons, head reference librarian who vanished in 1903. The photograph matches. May 15th, 1932. The children's section houses something that giggles. It moves books from shelves, rearranges the reading circle. I've started looking into the history of that section. It was once a storytelling room where hundreds of children gathered each week to hear tales of wonder and horror. May 30th, 1932. The basement scratching grows worse each night. I've traced the building's history. Before the library, this land held the gallows. Those condemned faced their death here, but also gained knowledge of what awaits beyond. Their fear still lives in that soil. June 10th, 1932. I've been watching the little girl. She appears in different sections, always asking for help. Today I noticed something. She appears most often in fiction, particularly near the darker stories. She embodies the shadows in these tales. June 28, 1932. I've come to understand that these entities aren't malevolent by nature. They're hungry for connection. Each represents how this library connects people to knowledge. This last entry hit me hard. The ghosts weren't just random hauntings. They had purpose, meaning. They were connected to the library's function in ways I hadn't thought about. I read on, learning how HS had created the early version of the rules, finding patterns in how the ghosts behaved. The writer documented how each ghost represented a different part of the library's purpose. The computer lab man, originally the reference librarian, represented the technological changes in information. He'd changed as the library changed, moving from physical books to digital catalogs to modern computers. The basement contained what HS called the fears we all hide deep down. It was where hidden knowledge lived, the kind that most people avoided facing. The giggling presence in the children's section stood for childhood imagination, the wonder and fear of discovering stories for the first time. And the little girl, perhaps the most dangerous, represented the darker parts of stories, the things about ourselves we see in fiction but can't admit to in real life. October 15th, 1932. I've established rules that seem to keep me safe. The entities cannot harm those who don't acknowledge them. They exist only when given attention. I'm sharing these rules with the head librarian tomorrow. God willing, no one else will disappear from this place. The journal ended there. No indication of what happened to HS or whether they survived their time at the library. I put the journal aside and opened the metal box. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, and staff records from the library's history. I laid them across the desk, looking at each one carefully. A staff photo from 1954 caught my eye. It showed a group of librarians standing on the front steps of the building. In the center of the back row was a woman who looked exactly like Sarah. The caption called her Sarah Miller, head librarian. I started to shake as I looked at the photograph more closely. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was her. The same face, the same way of standing, even the same cold look in her eyes. The only difference was that the white streaks in her hair were missing in the photograph. I looked through the box and found more photos. Sarah was in staff pictures from 1960, 1972, and 1989, always looking exactly the same, never getting older. The last item in the box was a newspaper clipping from 1952 with the headline, "Local Librarian Hospitalized After Late-Night Incident." The article said that Sarah Miller had been found unconscious in the library after working late. She had gotten better, but wouldn't talk about what had happened. 1952, 2 years before the staff photo where she already looked exactly as she did today, 70 years later. I sat back, trying to make sense of it all. Sarah hadn't just worked here long. She'd worked here for at least 70 years without aging. And according to the newspaper, something had happened to her in 1952. The pieces clicked together. The white streaks in her hair, just like mine. The way she made sure everyone followed the rules. The comment she'd made after seeing my hair. "You're learning the hard way, just like the rest of us." Sarah had broken a rule, just as I had. I put everything back in the hidden compartment except the 1954 staff photo, which I slipped into my pocket. I did my nighttime rounds on autopilot, my mind racing with questions. The entities showed up as usual. The giggling from the children's section, the man in the computer lab, the scratching at the basement door. But now I saw them differently, understanding their connections to the library itself. When dawn came and the front door opened, I was waiting. Sarah walked in, looking as neat as always in her dark suit. She stopped when she saw my face. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. Is everything all right?" I pulled out the photograph and held it up. "How long have you worked here, Sarah? Really?" She closed the door behind her, shutting out the early morning light. Her eyes moved from the photograph to my face. "Where did you find that?" "Hidden compartment in the security desk. There's a journal there too, from someone who worked here after Jacob disappeared. It says a lot about the entities, about what they really are." Sarah looked tired suddenly, more than just end-of-shift fatigue. She placed her bag on the circulation desk. "We should talk in my office." I followed her to the small room behind the circulation desk. Sarah's office seemed frozen in time. The desk was vintage, the telephone rotary, the filing cabinets metal instead of plastic. She sat behind her desk and gestured for me to take the chair opposite her. "I broke Rule 5 in 1952, she said without preamble. "A young woman asked me to help her find materials on local history. It was after hours. I knew the rules, but she seemed so lost. So human." Sarah's gaze drifted to the photograph I'd placed on her desk. "They took part of me, but I survived. Now I make sure others don't make the same mistakes." "What happened to you?" I asked. "The entities exist beyond our understanding of time. They took my future, my aging, my natural progression through life. I remain as I was that night, watching decades pass while I stay unchanged." Her fingers brushed against the white streaks in her hair. "These appeared immediately, just like yours did, a marker of their touch. The journal said they weren't malevolent originally, that they represent aspects of the library's purpose." Sarah nodded. "Yes, but they've changed. Each time someone breaks a rule and knows about them, they get stronger, more independent, more hungry." She leaned forward. "When this library was first built, the rules weren't needed. These things were just part of the building's character. They weren't dangerous back then. But people's fear gave them power. What people believed turned them into something dangerous. So the rules don't just protect us from them?" I asked. "The rules protect everyone," Sarah replied. "Every time an entity successfully takes someone, it grows more powerful, more separate from its original purpose. If enough rules are broken, enough people taken, the entities could eventually extend their reach beyond these walls." Her words hit me hard. I thought of Michael, the previous guard who had vanished after touching the computer lab man, of Jacob, who had documented his experiences until he disappeared, of William, whose voice still called from the basement. "How many people know about this?" I asked. "Very few. Most who discover the truth either leave immediately or become part of the library." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Those of us who remain marked but free carry the responsibility to maintain the balance." "Is that why you've stayed all these years? To protect people?" "Someone must. I made a choice in 1952 that altered my existence forever. I can't undo that, but I can prevent others from making worse mistakes." She picked up the photograph, studying her unchanged face. "The entities allowed me to survive because I serve a purpose. I enforce the rules. I maintain order. But I broke a rule, I said, touching the white in my hair. I opened the basement door. Yes, and you'll carry that mark forever, but you stopped before they could take all of you. Sarah handed the photograph back to me. You have a choice now, Mr. Henderson. You can walk away from this place, live your life with a few white hairs and occasional nightmares, or you can stay and help maintain the balance. What happens if the balance fails? Sarah looked at her office window as the morning got brighter. Then the hunger inside those things could get out beyond these walls. The rules don't just protect us, Thomas. They protect everyone. 3 months had passed since Sarah revealed her true nature to me. 3 months of learning how the entities behave, writing down what they do, and looking into the history of the Lincoln Public Library. I now understood why the white streaks in my hair never went away. They showed I had touched something weird that most people don't understand. I came in for my shift like normal, nodding to Emily as she packed up to leave. The library had just closed to the public, and the last people were walking out the front doors. "Another quiet day," Emily said, pulling on her coat. "Though we had a power flicker this afternoon, computers went down for about 10 seconds. "Probably just the weather," I said, glancing at the cloudy night sky through the windows. "They're calling for storms tonight." Emily looked at me with that mixture of concern and curiosity she'd worn since my hair had changed. She never asked about it directly, but I could tell she wondered. "Sarah's in her office," she said, heading for the door. "Take care tonight, Tom." I watched her leave, then made my way to Sarah's office. Sarah sat at her desk, sorting through paperwork. The room was filled with items from different decades: a rotary phone from the 50s, a modern computer, and really old filing cabinets. "Good evening, Mr. Henderson," she said without looking up. "Evening." I leaned against the door frame. "Everything normal today?" Sarah paused, her pen hovering over a form. "The power fluctuation is concerning. The entities have never affected external systems before." Since our conversation 3 months ago, Sarah had become more open about the library's secrets. She'd shown me records dating back to the building's construction, explained the true nature of each entity, and helped me understand the rules that kept us safe. "I'll keep an eye on things," I said. Sarah nodded, then checked her watch. "It's time for me to leave. Call if anything unusual happens." After she left, I began my rounds. The 9 p.m. check of the main floor was uneventful. The building creaked and settled as usual, but the entities remained dormant. I noted in the logbook that all doors were secure and moved on to the second floor. At 9:48 p.m., I was checking the reference section when the lights blinked. Not unusual in an old building, but I felt a chill run down my back. I checked my watch. The entities typically didn't become active until after midnight. Their patterns had been consistent for months. I continued my round, more alert now. When I reached the computer lab, I noticed something odd. All the monitors were on, glowing blue in the dim light, even though they had been shut down for the night. I stayed in the doorway, not entering the room. The man who typically appeared at midnight wasn't visible yet, but the active computers were a break in pattern. I made a note in my small pocket journal and continued my round. By 10:30 p.m., I had finished checking the third floor and returned to the main level. Everything seemed normal, but the nervous feeling wouldn't go away. I sat at the security desk and reviewed the camera feeds. Nothing out of place. At 11:17 p.m., the power went out completely. I waited for the backup generator to kick in, but only the emergency exit signs lit up with a red glow. Through the windows, I could see that the entire street was dark. This wasn't just the library. The whole neighborhood had lost power. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, trying the second channel. "Security to Sarah, do you copy?" Static answered me. I clicked to the facilities channel. "Security to maintenance. Generator status?" More static. I pulled out Jacob's journal and the notes I'd collected over the past months. Something wasn't right. The entities had never affected systems outside the building before. Sarah's concern about the earlier power fluctuation now seemed right on the money. A soft giggle came from the children's section, hours before its usual time. My flashlight shined in the darkness as I turned toward the sound. Nothing there, but the giggling continued, growing louder, joined by other kids' voices. I backed away, keeping to the main aisle. The rules had protected me for months. Don't investigate strange noises. Don't acknowledge anyone in the building after closing. Never open the basement door after midnight. Stay out of the children's section after 9 p.m. And don't engage with anyone asking for help finding materials. But tonight felt different. The rules assumed the entities would follow their own patterns. A loud crack rang through the building. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw the basement door moving in its frame. Another crack, and the wood splintered around the hinges. I backed toward the security desk. The basement entity had never tried to break through before. It had always just scratched and called, trying to lure security guards into opening the door. The monitors in the security office turned on even though the power was out. Each screen showed the computer lab man standing behind a terminal, looking directly at the camera. Not one image of him, but 12 identical figures on 12 different screens. He had never appeared in multiple places before. The basement door blew outward with a final crack, wood splinters flying across the hall. Darkness flowed from the opening, thick and heavy. It spread across the floor. My flashlight couldn't light up the darkness. I backed up the main aisle, trying to keep away from both the basement entity and the children's section, where the giggling had become a chorus of laughter. Something cold brushed against my ankle. I looked down to see the darkness from the basement moving around my feet, climbing up my legs. I kicked at it, but my foot passed through with only the feeling of biting cold. Thomas. The voice came from the center aisle ahead of me. I raised my flashlight to see the little girl walking slowly toward me. Her white dress caught the red emergency lighting, her black hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her face was different tonight, less human, the features sharper, the smile wider than any human mouth could stretch. "We're tired of the rules," she said, her voice resonating with others behind it, like a crowd speaking through one small body. "We've been patient. We've played the game. But now we're hungry." I kept backing away, remembering what Sarah had told me about the entities growing stronger each time someone broke a rule. Each mistake fed them, made them more powerful, more independent from their original purpose. "You can't ignore us anymore," the girl continued, her steps measured, unhurried. "We know you now, Thomas Henderson. We know your fears, your thoughts. We've been watching you study us. Did you think we weren't studying you too?" The darkness from the basement had spread throughout the main floor now, stretching up the walls. The giggling from the children's section had gotten louder and louder. On the security monitors, the 12 identical librarians started moving together, stepping away from their computers. I needed a plan. The entities had never teamed up like this before. They'd never broken their own rules. Jacob's journal, HS's notes, the building's history. I suddenly remembered something I'd read in the archives. The library had been built with protections, symbols built into the architecture itself. The original builders had known about the land's dark past and had added safety measures, the fire alarms. HS had written about a protection system connected to the original alarm network. I ran to the nearest alarm and pulled it. Nothing happened. No sound. No sprinklers. The power outage must have affected it too. The little girl laughed, her voice cutting through all the giggles and whispers that now filled the building. "Your tools won't work tonight," she said. "We've grown beyond your rules, beyond your protections." I thought frantically. The original system wouldn't have relied solely on electricity. Old buildings had mechanical backups, systems that worked on water pressure or springs. I ran toward the staff area, toward the original part of the building. The little girl followed, her pace never changing, yet somehow she never fell behind. The darkness from the basement flowed with me, around me, trying to trip me. In the old service corridor, I found what I was looking for. A red metal box mounted on the wall, labeled Fire Alarm 1887. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, covered in dust and cobwebs. I smashed the glass with my flashlight and pulled the lever inside. A deep, mechanical gonging sound spread through the building. Nothing like the modern electric alarms. This was a massive bell, the sound rumbling through the walls themselves. The little girl stopped, her unnaturally wide smile dropping. I ran to the next alarm box at the end of the corridor and pulled it too. Another gonging joined the first, the sounds overlapping, creating a pattern. The darkness around my feet backed away slightly. I remembered the floor plans I'd studied in the archives. There were 5 original alarm stations arranged in a specific pattern throughout the building. I needed to activate all of them. The third alarm was at the base of the main staircase. As I ran toward it, I saw the darkness pulling back from the walls, revealing something I'd never noticed before. Symbols carved into the wood paneling, now glowing with a faint blue light. Very old symbols of protection that had been hidden under layers of paint and time. I pulled the third alarm. The gonging grew louder, more insistent. The little girl was no longer following me. Instead, she stood in the center of the main floor, her head tilted as if listening. The giggling from the children's section had changed to whimpers. The fourth alarm was on the second floor. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the darkness trying to grab at my ankles but backing away from the growing blue light that now pulsed from the symbols on the walls. When I reached the fourth alarm and pulled it, the building seemed to shake with the overlapping bells. The symbols glowed brighter, forming lines of light that connected across walls and floors, creating a network of protection throughout the building. The computer lab man appeared at the end of the hallway, but he couldn't approach. The lines of blue light formed a barrier he couldn't cross. I had 1 more alarm to pull. The 5th was in the archives room. I ran down the hallway, the blue light growing stronger with each step. The archives room door was locked, but I had the keys. My hand shook as I tried to find the right one. Behind me, I heard the little girl's voice, sounding strained now. "Stop." I got the door open and rushed inside. The archives room housed the library's oldest and most valuable documents. In the center of the room stood a glass case containing the original deed to the property. The 5th alarm box was mounted on the wall behind the case. I pulled it, and the final gong joined the others, creating a resonance that made my teeth vibrate. The blue light from the symbols flared, bright enough to light up the entire building, but it wasn't enough. I could feel the entities regrouping, pushing against the barriers of light. The little girl's voice carried throughout the building. "This won't hold us. We've grown too strong." I remembered what HS had written in their journal. The entities were connected to the building through its history, its purpose. The deed in the glass case represented the original binding of the land to its new purpose as a library. It was the physical link between the entities and the building. I smashed the glass case with a paperweight from the curator's desk. The alarms kept ringing as I lifted the very old document from the broken case. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still readable. This deed had transformed execution grounds into a place of learning. "No!" The little girl's scream echoed through the building, filled with rage and fear. I took my lighter from my pocket, a habit from my former smoking days, and held it to the corner of the document. The paper caught immediately, flames burning up the dry parchment. The effect was instant. The darkness pulled back completely toward the basement. The giggling stopped. The computer lab man disappeared from all monitors. The little girl's scream cut off suddenly, as the deed burned to ash in my hands. The blue light from the symbols pulsed once more, then faded. The gonging of the alarm slowed, then stopped. The emergency lights blinked, and then the main power came back on, with normal lighting throughout the building. I stood in the archives room, surrounded by broken glass and ashes, exhausted, but alive. The clock on the wall read 5:47 a.m. Dawn was coming. I made my way back to the main floor. Everything looked normal. Books on shelves, furniture in place. The basement door hung broken on its hinges, but beyond it I saw only ordinary darkness, not the strange blackness from before. The front doors opened, and Sarah walked in. She stopped when she saw me, looking at my messy appearance and the ashes on my hands. Her eyes moved to the basement door, then back to me. "You've reset the balance," she said simply. "The rules will work again, for now." I nodded, too tired for questions. "The deed?" she asked. "Burned." She closed her eyes briefly. "That was the right choice. The connection has been severed temporarily. It will reform, of course. These buildings always do. But you've bought us time." I looked around at the library, now quiet in the morning light. "What happens now?" "Now you make your choice," Sarah said. "You can walk away, live your life, or you can stay and join those of us who maintain the balance." I understood the choice before me. I could leave this place with its dangers, try to forget what I'd seen. Or I could stay and fight a battle that had gone on for centuries, a battle to contain the entities, to maintain the rules, to protect people from these threats. I looked down at my flashlight. I thought of Michael, of Jacob, of William, of all those who had come before me. I thought of the white streaks in my hair that would never fade, showing I'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. I picked up my security logbook from the desk and wrote a simple entry. 6 a.m., all secure. I had made my choice. I was staying. The university's funding email had made this opportunity sound like a dream assignment. 3 months of atmospheric research in Alaska, decent pay, and enough isolation to focus entirely on data collection without distractions. I'd packed my equipment with genuine excitement, imagining the breakthrough research that might come from such pristine conditions. Now, stepping out of the supply truck that had carried me the final 30 miles from the nearest town, I questioned every decision that had led me here. The research station squatted against the white landscape like a metal tumor, its dark walls stark against snow that stretched to every horizon. No trees, no hills, no variation whatsoever. Just flat white emptiness that seemed to swallow sound and perspective alike. The wind cut through my heavy jacket as if the fabric didn't exist, and I realized my preparation for cold weather had been laughably inadequate. Daniel Martinez, I presume. The voice belonged to a man who'd emerged from the station's main entrance. He looked like he'd been carved from the same harsh material as the landscape itself. Weathered face, graying beard, and eyes that held the steady wariness of someone who'd seen too much. "David Miller, I run this place." I hefted my duffel bag and approached, fighting the urge to hurry. The cold bit at every exposed inch of skin, making my nose run and my eyes water. "Thanks for having me. The university said you might need an extra hand with atmospheric readings." David's handshake was brief but firm. "Come on. Let's get you inside before you freeze to death your first day." The station's interior hit me like a wall of stale air and artificial heat. Cramped corridors lined with pipes and electrical conduits led past what appeared to be labs, storage rooms, and living quarters. Every window I glimpsed had been covered with thick, dark curtains that blocked out any view of the outside world. The effect was claustrophobic, like being sealed inside a submarine. "Drop your gear in here." David opened a door to reveal a small room with a narrow bed, a desk, and barely enough floor space to walk around. Not the Ritz, but it's warm and the walls are thick. I set down my bag and followed him back into the corridor. The muffled quality of our footsteps and voices made everything feel unnaturally quiet, as if the building itself absorbed sound. Other doors stood closed along the hallway, and I caught myself wondering how many people actually worked here. "Before you settle in, we need to cover the station rules." David's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're survival requirements, and breaking them can get you killed." The dramatic phrasing made me want to smile, but something in his expression stopped me. I'd expected the usual workplace safety briefings about proper equipment handling and emergency procedures. This felt different. First rule: never look outside between 11:11 and 3:33. Doesn't matter if you hear something. Doesn't matter if you think you see movement. Those windows stay covered during those hours. And you don't peek. I opened my mouth to ask what could possibly be dangerous about looking outside, but David continued without pause. Second, never answer knocking at the door during night hours. If someone knocks after dark, you ignore it completely. No exceptions, no matter what you think you hear. My scientific training kicked in, demanding explanations for these bizarre prohibitions. What kind of research station operated under such paranoid restrictions? Third, every Monday at exactly 5 p.m., we do a supply check. Full inventory, every item accounted for. You'll be assigned specific areas to cover. Fourth, report any holes in the ice immediately. You see a hole that wasn't there before, you tell me right away. Fifth, report strange behavior from staff members. If someone starts acting unusual or saying odd things, I need to know. Sixth, never go outside after dark. Not for any reason. Equipment emergency, fire, doesn't matter. After sunset, this building is sealed until dawn. The rules hung in the air between us like a challenge. I processed each one, trying to find rational explanations for what sounded like elaborate superstitions. Isolation psychology, maybe. Extended periods in harsh environments could definitely affect judgment and spawn irrational fears. I know how they sound, David said as if reading my thoughts. You're thinking this is paranoid nonsense brought on by too much isolation. Every new researcher thinks that. Before I could respond, footsteps approached from deeper in the corridor. A woman appeared, middle-aged, practical-looking, wearing the same heavy indoor clothing that seemed standard here. Sarah Johnson, she introduced herself with a brief nod. How much have you told him? Just finished the rules, David replied. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Good. Let me be clear about something, Daniel. Those rules David just gave you, they're not suggestions. They're not outdated protocols or superstitious nonsense. People who break them don't make it home. The matter-of-fact way she said it sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine. These weren't people prone to dramatic exaggeration. Their entire bearing suggested practical, experienced professionals. Yet, here they were, speaking about window curtains and knocking sounds as if they were matters of life and death. I understand you're skeptical, Sarah continued. That's normal. But skepticism won't protect you if you decide to test these rules. The Arctic doesn't care about your scientific training or rational worldview. I wanted to ask what exactly they thought was outside that could be so dangerous. Bears, maybe? Extreme weather phenomena? But something in their shared glances suggested they weren't going to elaborate, at least not yet. Let me show you the common areas, David said, apparently considering the orientation complete. We walked through a kitchen area equipped with industrial appliances and a dining space with a single long table. Every surface looked well maintained but showed signs of heavy use. More covered windows lined the walls, creating the same oppressive sense of enclosure I'd felt throughout the building. Meals are communal, Sarah explained. We eat together, work together, look out for each other. In a place like this, teamwork isn't optional. As if summoned by her words, another figure emerged from what appeared to be a lab area. A man in his 30s, pale and thin, wearing a heavy sweater that seemed too large for his frame. He glanced at me briefly, but didn't speak. Thomas Brown, David said. He handles our meteorological readings. Thomas nodded once in my direction, then turned his attention to one of the covered windows. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, as if listening for something beyond the thick curtains. Thomas, Sarah said quietly. He blinked and walked away without a word, disappearing back into the lab area. He's been here 8 months, David explained after Thomas was gone. Takes a while to adjust to the isolation. I noted the interaction with growing unease. Thomas's behavior had been odd, but the way Sarah and David reacted suggested this wasn't unusual. The idea that extended isolation could affect people so dramatically was concerning, especially given that I'd committed to spending 3 months here myself. The tour continued through lab spaces equipped with atmospheric monitoring equipment, storage rooms packed with supplies, and mechanical areas housing generators and heating systems. Everything was functional but cramped, and the constant presence of covered windows made it impossible to forget we were sealed inside this metal box. As evening approached, I noticed the staff beginning what appeared to be a ritual. Sarah moved through the common areas, checking that curtains were properly positioned. David tested the locks on all exterior doors. Even Thomas emerged from his lab to inspect window coverings in his area. "Nightly routine," David explained when he caught me watching. "We double-check everything before dark." I helped Sarah with the remaining windows, pulling heavy blankets over glass that had been left uncovered during daylight hours. The blankets were thick and black, designed to block out every trace of light or view. As we worked, the oppressive atmosphere of the station intensified, transforming from merely claustrophobic to actively unsettling. "Why cover them all?" I asked as we secured the last blanket. "Seems like natural light would be good for morale." Sarah paused in her work. "Natural light during the day is fine, but after dark, these windows stay covered. Period." The finality in her voice made it clear this wasn't open for discussion. I finished helping with the blankets, trying to shake off the growing sense that I'd committed to something far more complex than atmospheric research. As the evening routine concluded and the staff settled into their normal activities, I found myself standing in the kitchen area, processing everything I'd learned. The rules, the covered windows, the strange behavior patterns, none of it aligned with my expectations of a scientific research facility. My academic training had prepared me for data collection, equipment maintenance, and the challenge of working in extreme conditions. It hadn't prepared me for elaborate behavioral restrictions that sounded more like folklore than safety protocols. The rational part of my mind insisted that prolonged isolation could indeed create paranoid thinking patterns, and that these rules were likely the product of too many people spending too much time in an enclosed space. But watching David and Sarah move through their evening preparations with practiced efficiency, seeing the genuine concern in their expressions when discussing the rules, made it harder to dismiss their warnings as simple paranoia. These were experienced professionals who'd survived in this environment long enough to become experts. If they believed these precautions were necessary, maybe I needed to consider that they knew something I didn't. Still, the scientific method demanded evidence, and so far I'd seen nothing that couldn't be explained by isolation psychology and extreme weather conditions. Whatever had convinced my colleagues that elaborate window-covering rituals were necessary for survival, I was confident my rational approach would help me adapt to the harsh environment without falling into the same superstitious patterns. Chapter 2. My first night in the small room felt like being sealed inside a metal coffin. The narrow bed was surprisingly comfortable, but the complete absence of outside light or sound made it impossible to gauge time or orientation. I tried reading through some research notes, organizing my equipment, anything to distract from the oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Around 11, I finally gave up on productive activity and changed into sleep clothes, though my internal clock felt completely scrambled. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical precision, and occasionally I heard muffled footsteps or doors closing elsewhere in the station. Normal sounds of people settling in for the night. I was lying on the narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling and questioning my decision to take this assignment, when my watch face glowed 11:11 p.m. The first sound came from directly above my room, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the roof. I sat up, listening intently. The scraping moved from left to right, then paused. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations. Ice buildup sliding off the roof, thermal expansion causing structural settling, Arctic wind carrying debris across the metal surface. All perfectly reasonable possibilities for a building in extreme weather conditions. Then came the footsteps. Not the quick patter of small animals or the random impact of falling ice. These were measured, purposeful steps that circled the station with mechanical precision. Each footfall landed with enough force to vibrate through the building's frame, making my bed shake slightly. The rhythm was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. I swung my legs out of bed and moved toward the covered window in my room. My hand reached for the edge of the heavy blanket before David's words echoed in my memory. Never look outside between 11:11 and 3:33. Breaking them can get you killed. The scientific part of my brain screamed that this was exactly the kind of irrational behavior that isolation bred. Whatever was outside could be observed, documented, explained through proper investigation. Knowledge was always better than fear-based superstition. But my hand stopped inches from the curtain fabric. The footsteps completed their circuit around the building and began again, this time accompanied by that scraping sound. Something was systematically moving around the station's perimeter, and the impacts were strong enough to transmit through the foundation into my room. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt each step as a distinct vibration. Around midnight, the sounds intensified. The scraping became more violent, as if whatever was outside had started clawing at the building's exterior walls. The footsteps quickened their pace, circling faster with increasing urgency. Then came a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. Howling. Not the familiar cry of wolves or the whistle of wind through structures. This was something deeper, more guttural, with an otherworldly quality that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest cavity. The sound rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like language, though no language I'd ever heard. I found myself pressing both hands against my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it seemed to penetrate through bone and tissue. The howling continued in waves, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it felt like the source was directly outside my window. Then the knocking started. Methodical, persistent raps on what sounded like the main entrance. Not the frantic pounding of someone seeking emergency shelter, but patient, rhythmic knocking that continued without variation. Knock, knock, knock. A brief pause. Then the pattern repeated. I heard movement in the corridor outside my room. Soft footsteps, then Sarah's voice in a barely audible whisper. It's just wind. We all know it's just wind. Her words carried no conviction whatsoever. The knocking continued, relentless and mechanical, for what felt like 20 minutes. During this time, the scraping and footsteps never stopped. Whatever was outside wasn't a single entity. Multiple things were moving around the station simultaneously. The knocking shifted. Instead of coming from the main entrance, the sound now originated from the side of the building. Then the back, then another side. Whatever was responsible moved around the station's perimeter, testing each door and entrance with the same patient, methodical rapping. The urgency in the knocking increased. What had been steady and mechanical became more aggressive, more insistent. The sound of something trying different entrances with growing determination. Each new location brought the noise closer to my room, and I realized that if I'd been standing at the window, I would have been mere feet away from whatever was making these sounds. I pulled my pillow over my head, but the knocking penetrated through every layer of fabric and insulation. The howling continued between the rapping sessions, sometimes rising to a pitch that made my teeth ache. The building vibrated constantly now with the movement of multiple large forms circling and testing our defenses. My scientific training kept trying to assert itself. Animals seeking shelter, seismic activity, extreme weather phenomena. But the systematic nature of the sounds, the way they tested each entrance in sequence, the almost intelligent pattern to the investigation, none of it fit natural explanations. Hours passed in this acoustic torment. I watched my watch face change from midnight to 1 a.m., then 2, then 3. The sounds never diminished, never paused for more than a few seconds. Whatever was outside possessed inhuman endurance and patience. At exactly 3:33 a.m., everything stopped. The silence was so abrupt and complete that my ears rang from the sudden absence of noise. No gradual fading, no distant footsteps retreating into the wilderness. One moment the building shook with activity, the next it was as if nothing had ever been there. I lay in bed, straining to hear any residual sound, but found only the normal mechanical noises of the heating system and the distant hum of electrical equipment. The oppressive quiet that had bothered me earlier now felt like a blessing. Sleep was impossible. I spent the remaining hours until dawn lying motionless, processing what I'd experienced. Every rational explanation I could construct fell apart under the systematic, intelligent nature of what I'd witnessed. This wasn't random animal behavior or weather phenomena. Something had methodically investigated our station, tested our defenses, and demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything I thought I understood about Arctic wildlife. When early morning light began filtering through gaps around the covered windows, I dressed quickly and made my way to the kitchen area. My legs felt unsteady, and I realized I'd been unconsciously holding tension in every muscle for hours. Sarah was already there, making coffee with practiced efficiency. She looked tired, but not particularly disturbed, as if the night's events had been routine. "Sleep well?" she asked without looking up. "Not particularly. Did you hear those sounds last night?" "What sounds?" Her tone was carefully neutral. I studied her expression, trying to determine if she was genuinely unaware or deliberately avoiding the topic. The way she'd whispered about wind suggested she'd heard everything I had. "Nothing, I guess. Must have been the building settling." Sarah nodded and handed me a mug of coffee. Arctic nights can be unsettling until you get used to them. After breakfast, I needed fresh air and perspective. The previous night felt like a fever dream, and I hoped that daylight and normal outdoor activities would help restore my rational worldview. I bundled into my heavy winter gear and stepped outside for the first time since my arrival. The morning air was brutally cold, but crystal clear. Sunlight reflected off snow that stretched to every horizon, creating a landscape so white and featureless it hurt to look at directly. After the claustrophobic atmosphere of the station, the open space felt liberating. I walked around the building's perimeter, ostensibly to familiarize myself with the facility's exterior layout. In reality, I was looking for evidence of the previous night's activity. What I found made my blood run cold. Massive indentations marked the snow around the entire station, not the scattered tracks of normal wildlife, but deep, purposeful impressions that followed a systematic pattern. The prints, if they could be called that, were enormous, each one nearly 3 feet across, and pressed so deeply into the frozen ground that they'd broken through the snow layer into the earth beneath. I knelt beside one of the clearer impressions, trying to make sense of its shape. The outline was roughly circular but irregular, with what appeared to be claw marks radiating from the edges. Whatever had made these tracks possessed weight and size far beyond any Arctic animal I could identify. The prints circled the station exactly as I'd tracked the sounds the night before, around the main entrance, along each side wall, testing every door and window. Some areas showed evidence of scraping against the building's exterior, long gouges in the metal siding that matched the sounds I'd heard. Find something interesting? I spun around to find David approaching, his expression grim but unsurprised. "These tracks," I said, gesturing at the indentations. "What kind of animal makes prints this size?" David examined the marks with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen them before. His lack of shock or curiosity was more unsettling than the tracks themselves. "Some things are better left uninvestigated," he said finally. "You'd do well to remember that." "But the size of these impressions?" "I know what size they are." David's tone cut off further discussion. "I also know that asking too many questions about them doesn't lead anywhere good." He walked away, leaving me standing alone beside evidence that challenged every assumption I'd brought to this place. The tracks were real, physical proof that something far outside normal parameters had visited our station. Yet David's response suggested that acknowledging this reality was somehow dangerous. I spent another hour examining the impressions, measuring their dimensions and spacing, trying to construct any plausible explanation for their existence. But as the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher, the tracks began to blur and soften as the snow warmed. By midday, they would be gone, leaving only my memory and growing certainty that the rules I'd dismissed as paranoid superstition were the only thing standing between us and something I wasn't equipped to understand. The rest of Monday passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt increasingly brittle. After David's warning about the tracks, I threw myself into settling into the research routine, unpacking my atmospheric monitoring equipment and familiarizing myself with the station's data collection protocols. The work felt reassuring. Concrete procedures, measurable variables, rational explanations for natural phenomena. Everything my scientific training had prepared me to handle. At exactly 5 p.m., David's voice echoed through the station's intercom system. Monday supply check. Everyone to your assigned areas. I followed Sarah to the main storage room, where she handed me a clipboard with inventory sheets. The routine was methodical and precise, counting every can, bag, and container, checking expiration dates, noting any discrepancies from the master list. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, calling out items while I tracked quantities on the forms. Canned tomatoes, 12 units, dried beans, 8 bags, pasta, 15 boxes. Her voice carried the monotone rhythm of someone who'd performed this task hundreds of times. I was halfway through checking the canned goods section when my pen stopped moving. "Sarah, what's this?" She looked over to where I was pointing at an empty can sitting in the trash bin near the shelving unit. The label was clearly visible. Premium cat food. Salmon flavor. "That's odd." Sarah picked up the can and examined it. "We don't have any cats here." I checked the supply manifest on my clipboard, running my finger down the list of delivered items. No pet food of any kind appeared on the records. The can wasn't weathered or old. The label was bright and new, suggesting recent purchase and consumption. "Maybe it got mixed in with a personal order by mistake," I suggested. Sarah set the can on the nearest shelf and continued with the inventory, but I caught her looking back at it several times. Her expression held the same careful wariness I'd seen when she discussed the station rules. 20 minutes later, we discovered something worse. "Daniel, come look at this." Sarah was crouched behind a stack of supply crates in the back corner of the storage room. When I joined her, she pointed to 3 bags of dry cat food sitting on the floor. Each bag was 20 pounds, still sealed, with purchase stickers indicating they'd been bought within the last month. "These weren't on the delivery manifest either," she said quietly. I checked the inventory sheets again, looking for any mention of pet supplies or items that might have been miscategorized. Nothing. According to our official records, these bags didn't exist. Could someone have ordered them privately? All orders go through David. Nothing comes to the station without being logged. Sarah's voice carried a tension that made my stomach clench. These appeared somewhere they shouldn't be. We finished the supply check in uncomfortable silence. The unexplained cat food items sat there like evidence of something we couldn't name or understand. When we completed the count and double-checked our numbers, I noticed Sarah made no notation about the cat food on the official inventory forms. I found Thomas in the meteorological station, a cramped room filled with monitoring equipment and computer terminals. He was standing motionless in front of a covered window, his back to me, hands at his sides. "Thomas, we found something weird during the supply check." He didn't respond or turn around. There was cat food in storage, multiple items that aren't on any delivery records. I waited for him to acknowledge what I'd said, but he remained perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the quiet humming of electronic equipment and the distant rumble of the heating system. "Thomas?" Finally, he turned around. His movement was unnaturally slow, like someone emerging from deep sleep. When his eyes met mine, they held an expression I couldn't read. not quite recognition, not quite confusion. Something else entirely. He looked at me without blinking for what felt like an entire minute. Not the brief, awkward pause of someone processing information, but a sustained, unnerving stare that made me want to step backward. His eyes didn't move or shift focus. They remained fixed on my face with mechanical precision. Then, without a word, he walked past me and left the room. I stood there processing what had just happened. Thomas's behavior was far beyond the normal effects of isolation or social awkwardness. The way he'd stared at me felt predatory, as if he was studying my features for some purpose I couldn't fathom. Later that afternoon, David's voice again crackled through the intercom. Everyone outside. Found something near the generator shed. I bundled into my winter gear and joined Sarah and Thomas in the brutal cold. David was standing about 50 feet from the station's main building, near a metal shed that housed backup generators and fuel storage. Even from a distance, I could see he was looking down at something in the snow. As we approached, the object of his attention became clear. A perfectly round hole had been cut through the ice, creating a dark opening roughly 3 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth and precise, as if someone had used a giant cookie cutter to remove a section of frozen ground. "When did this appear?" Sarah asked. "Wasn't here this morning when I checked the generators," David replied. "Found it an hour ago during routine maintenance." I knelt beside the hole and peered into the blackness below. The opening seemed impossibly deep. My flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness without revealing a bottom. No matter how I adjusted the angle or brightness, the light was simply swallowed by whatever lay beneath the ice. "How deep does it go?" David was already walking back toward the station. "Deep enough. Stay here." He returned carrying a large pot of steaming water from the kitchen. Without explanation, he began pouring the hot water directly into the hole. The liquid disappeared into the blackness without making any sound. No splash, no echo, nothing to indicate it had reached a bottom. "What are you doing?" "Holes like this attract things from below the ice," David said, continuing to pour. "Hot water keeps them from using it as an exit point." The casual way he said it, as if sealing mysterious holes against subterranean creatures was routine maintenance, made my scientific worldview feel increasingly unstable. I wanted to ask what things he meant, but his expression discouraged further questions. We returned inside as the sun began setting and evening routines commenced. During dinner, the four of us sat around the long table in the kitchen area, eating reheated stew and canned vegetables. Conversation was minimal, mostly logistics about equipment schedules and weather observations. I was discussing atmospheric pressure readings with Sarah when I noticed Thomas had stopped eating. His fork was suspended halfway between his bowl and mouth, loaded with food but completely motionless. He was looking at something behind me, his expression vacant and unfocused. "Thomas?" Sarah said. No response. Thomas remained frozen in position, as if someone had pressed a pause button on his movements. His eyes were fixed on the wall behind my chair, but they didn't seem to be looking at anything specific. They held the same mechanical quality I'd observed earlier, but now combined with complete physical stillness that was deeply unsettling. I turned to follow his line of sight, but the wall was blank except for a few mounted emergency procedures and shift schedules, nothing that should have captured such intense attention. "Thomas," Sarah repeated more firmly. She reached across the table and touched his shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, Thomas jerked back to awareness with a sharp intake of breath. The fork continued its journey to his mouth as if nothing had happened. "Sorry. What?" "You were somewhere else for a moment," Sarah said carefully. Thomas looked around the table with apparent confusion. "Was I? I don't remember." The complete absence of memory was perhaps the most disturbing part. Thomas showed no awareness that he'd been catatonic for nearly 10 minutes, no recollection of what had captured his attention or why he'd stopped moving. After dinner, I helped clean dishes while processing the day's events. The cat food, the hole in the ice, Thomas's episodes, each incident individually might have rational explanations. Food delivery mistakes happened. Ground could shift and create openings. Isolation could cause dissociative episodes. But taken together, they formed a pattern that my scientific training couldn't accommodate. These weren't random occurrences or psychological effects of harsh conditions. They were systematic anomalies that suggested something fundamental about this place existed outside normal parameters. The staff's reactions bothered me as much as the events themselves. David's calm acceptance of mysterious holes, Sarah's careful documentation of impossible supply discrepancies, Thomas's complete memory lapses. None of them seemed surprised by what was happening. They responded to each incident with the weary recognition of people who'd seen it all before. Standing in the kitchen, drying plates while Sarah organized supplies for tomorrow's meals, I realized my comfortable skepticism was crumbling. Whatever was affecting this station wasn't isolation, madness, or environmental psychology. Something was genuinely wrong with this place. Something that turned normal research protocols into survival requirements and made covering windows a matter of life and death. The rules I dismissed as paranoid superstition were starting to feel like the only rational response to circumstances that defied rational explanation. I woke on the fourth morning with the taste of unease already coating my mouth. The heating system's mechanical breathing filled the silence as I dressed. But something felt different about the station's atmosphere. A subtle shift that made my skin crawl without any obvious cause. The kitchen was empty when I arrived, which wasn't unusual given the early hour. I opened the storage room to prepare breakfast and immediately knew something was wrong. The shelves looked sparse in a way that didn't match my memory from the previous evening's inventory. I pulled out my notebook and compared the current contents against the supply list we'd completed Monday night. 3 cans of beans were missing, 2 boxes of pasta, an entire bag of flour that should have lasted weeks. The numbers didn't add up to normal consumption, even accounting for 4 people eating 3 meals daily. More unsettling were the crumb trails I found leading away from the storage area. Fine traces of breadcrumbs and flour formed distinct paths across the floor, winding through the common areas towards sections of the station I'd never seen anyone enter. One trail disappeared under a maintenance closet door that had been sealed with multiple layers of industrial tape. I knelt beside the closet and examined the door frame. The tape showed recent disturbance, edges peeled back just enough for something small to slip through. The crumb trail continued right up to the gap, as if whatever had taken our food was storing it in there. The rational part of my brain suggested mice or other rodents, but the quantity of missing supplies ruled out normal pest activity. Animals didn't make off with entire containers or leave such organized trails. This looked more like systematic removal by something with purpose and intelligence. Sarah found me crouched by the closet when she came to start breakfast preparations. "What are you doing down there?" I showed her the crumb trails and explained the inventory discrepancies. Her expression grew progressively more troubled as I detailed exactly what was missing and in what quantities. "That's not possible," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "We accounted for everything Monday." "Look at the numbers yourself." Sarah spent 20 minutes rechecking the storage room contents against our official lists. Her face went pale as the magnitude of the shortage became clear. "Someone's been taking food during the night," I said. "Multiple meals worth." "Nobody here would do that." I wanted to agree, but the evidence was undeniable. Food was disappearing in quantities no single person could consume, and the crumb trails suggested it was being moved to areas nobody should have been accessing. When David arrived for breakfast, I showed him the inventory problems and the sealed closet with disturbed tape. His reaction was what bothered me most, not surprise or concern, but a weary acceptance that made my stomach clench. "These things happen sometimes," he said, as if massive food theft was routine maintenance. "Things like what?" "Someone's been stealing from our supplies." David examined the crumb trails with the same detached interest he'd shown when looking at the mysterious tracks outside. No shock, no urgency about our depleting resources. "I'll look into it," he said finally, but his tone suggested he had no intention of investigating anything. Thomas appeared during this conversation, emerging from his lab area with the same vacant expression I'd grown to expect. He moved through the kitchen without acknowledging any of us, going straight to the covered window near the dining table. He stood motionless in front of the heavy curtains for several minutes, close enough that his breath fogged the fabric. His posture was unnaturally rigid, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly as if listening for something beyond the glass. "Thomas, breakfast is ready," Sarah called. No response. Thomas remained frozen in position, completely absorbed by whatever held his attention behind the covered window. The sight of him standing there sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. I approached him carefully, noting how his eyes were fixed on one specific section of the curtain. Up close, I could see his pupils were dilated despite the bright kitchen lighting, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Thomas, you need to eat." My voice seemed to reach him from a great distance. He blinked several times, then turned toward me with the slow, disoriented movement of someone emerging from a trance. "Did you say something?" The complete absence of memory was becoming a pattern. Thomas showed no awareness of how long he'd been standing there or what had captured his attention. He joined us at the table and ate mechanically, but I caught him looking back at the covered window repeatedly throughout the meal. Later that morning, I was calibrating atmospheric monitoring equipment when I heard Sarah's voice from the storage room. "Thomas, what are you doing in here?" I found them both standing beside the sealed maintenance closet. Thomas had his hands on the tape around the door frame, and several strips had been partially peeled away. "I thought I heard something inside," he said, but his explanation sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. Sarah looked at the disturbed tape, then at Thomas, her expression growing concerned. "This area is sealed for safety reasons. Nobody should be opening it." Thomas nodded and walked away, but I noticed he kept looking back at the closet as he left. The way he'd been working at the tape suggested he'd been trying to gain access for some time, not responding to a sudden noise. That afternoon brought another disturbing discovery. I was organizing research notes in my room when Sarah knocked on my door. "Can I talk to you privately?" She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, keeping her voice to a whisper. "Thomas has been asking questions about you. Personal information that doesn't make sense for someone at a research station." The hair on my neck stood up. "What kind of questions?" "Your home address, details about your family members, whether you live alone." Sarah's expression was deeply troubled. "He wanted to know if anyone would notice if you didn't return from this assignment." The implications of Thomas's inquiries made my blood run cold. There was no legitimate reason for a meteorologist at an isolated station to need personal information about a colleague's home life or family situation. Why would he ask those things? I don't know, but it's not normal behavior, even accounting for isolation effects. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's been different since you arrived, more fixated on things he shouldn't be interested in." The idea that my presence had somehow triggered changes in Thomas's behavior was deeply unsettling. Whatever was affecting him seemed to be accelerating, becoming more focused and potentially dangerous. That evening, I spent several hours calculating our remaining food supplies with scientific precision. No matter how I adjusted the numbers or accounted for potential errors, the results were consistently alarming. Based on normal consumption patterns, we had maybe 2 days of food remaining. The next scheduled supply delivery wasn't due for 3 weeks. Even with severe rationing, we couldn't stretch our resources to cover that gap. The missing food represented more than inconvenience. It was a genuine survival crisis that nobody seemed willing to address directly. I found David in his office, reviewing meteorological reports and maintenance schedules. When I presented my calculations about our food shortage, his reaction was even more disturbing than his earlier indifference. "You think we're running out of supplies?" "I know we are. Look at these numbers." David examined my calculations with the same detached interest he'd shown for every other anomaly. No urgency, no concern about potential starvation in an isolated location. "Maybe you should consider leaving early," he said finally. The suggestion hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Not a helpful recommendation or concerned advice, but something that felt much more like a threat. "The supply truck won't be back for 3 weeks. There are other ways to leave." David's eyes went completely blank as he said this. Not the vacant expression of someone lost in thought, but a total absence of awareness that lasted several seconds. When focus returned to his features, he looked at me as if surprised to find me standing there. The transformation was brief, but unmistakable. For those few moments, David had been somewhere else entirely, and whatever had been speaking through him carried implications that made every instinct in my body scream warnings. I left his office with the growing certainty that our food shortage wasn't accidental or natural. Someone, or something, was systematically depleting our resources, creating a crisis that would force difficult choices. The station's rules suddenly felt less like paranoid restrictions and more like the only barrier standing between us and something that wanted us gone, or worse, wanted us desperate enough to break those rules and face whatever waited outside in the Arctic darkness. My hands shook as I pulled on every layer of winter gear I owned, but not from the cold. The decision had been eating at me for hours, growing more urgent as our food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. 1 can of beans and half a bag of rice remained in storage, maybe enough for breakfast if we stretched it thin. David's suggestion about other ways to leave kept echoing in my head, along with that blank expression that had replaced his features when he said it. Whatever was happening to the station staff was accelerating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that staying much longer would mean joining Thomas in his catatonic episodes or losing myself to whatever influence had already claimed them. The snowmobile sat in the equipment shed behind the main building, a heavy-duty Arctic model designed for exactly this kind of terrain. I'd checked it during my first week, noting the full fuel tank and emergency supplies strapped to the back. 15 miles to Coldwater, the nearest town marked on every map I'd studied, a manageable distance if I pushed hard and didn't stop for anything. I slipped out of my room at exactly 9 p.m., moving through the station's corridors with practiced stealth. The heating system's mechanical breathing masked my footsteps, and the covered windows made it impossible for anyone to see outside. David was in his office reviewing reports. Sarah was organizing supplies in the kitchen. Thomas was standing motionless in front of another covered window, lost in whatever trance claimed him each evening. None of them noticed me leaving. The equipment shed door opened with a metallic groan that sounded thunderous in the Arctic silence. I wheeled the snowmobile outside, my breath forming instant clouds in air so cold it burned my lungs through the heavy face mask. The temperature gauge on my gear showed minus 38 degrees, brutal even by Arctic standards. The moment I stepped fully outside, something changed in the quality of darkness around me. Not a visible alteration, but a shift in presence that made every nerve in my body fire warning signals. The black expanse beyond the station's exterior lights felt populated now, filled with attention that hadn't been there during my brief daytime excursions. I was being watched. The snowmobile's engine turned over reluctantly, mechanical parts protesting the extreme temperature. 3 attempts before it caught, rumbling to life with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire tundra. I adjusted the headlight beam and checked the GPS unit mounted on the handlebars. Coldwater lay 15 miles due south, a straight shot across relatively flat terrain. I twisted the throttle and shot away from the station into complete darkness. The headlight carved a narrow tunnel through the black, illuminating maybe 30 feet of snow-covered ground ahead of me. Beyond that beam, the world ceased to exist. No horizon, no reference points, just an endless void that swallowed light and sound alike. The snowmobile's engine roared beneath me, but the noise felt muffled and small against the vast silence pressing in from all directions. 5 miles out, the GPS showed I was making good time despite the challenging terrain. The engine had warmed up enough to run smoothly, and the fuel gauge still showed 3/4 full. At this pace, I'd reach Coldwater in under an hour. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large shifted just beyond the headlight's reach, keeping pace with my snowmobile despite my speed of nearly 40 miles per hour. I turned my head to get a better look, but the moment I focused on the area, nothing was there, just empty darkness and wind-blown snow. I accelerated, pushing the snowmobile harder across the uneven ground. The speedometer climbed to 50, then 55. The movement stayed with me, matching my pace effortlessly. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of something massive moving parallel to my route, but every direct look revealed only darkness. Whatever was out there, it was big enough to leave visible disturbance in the snow. I could see the faint traces of its passage in my peripheral vision, displaced powder and irregular shadows that suggested something moving with purpose and intelligence. Not the random wandering of an animal, but deliberate tracking behavior. 7 miles from the station, the presence shifted position. Instead of pacing me from the side, I caught movement directly ahead of my headlight beam. Something crossed from left to right just at the edge of visibility, fast enough that I only registered a brief impression of size and darkness before it disappeared. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized what that meant. Whatever was following me had somehow gotten ahead of my position without passing through the lighted area. It had moved around me through the darkness, covering ground faster than my snowmobile despite the difficult terrain. That wasn't possible for any normal animal. I pushed the throttle to maximum, feeling the snowmobile strain against its mechanical limits. The engine screamed in protest, but the speedometer climbed past 60. Snow and ice chips flew past my goggles in a constant stream, and the cold air penetrated every gap in my protective gear. The movement in my peripheral vision intensified. Whatever was out there seemed energized by my acceleration, becoming more active and aggressive. I caught glimpses of something keeping perfect pace with me, sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, occasionally appearing ahead of me as if it had teleported through the darkness. 9 miles out, something brushed against the back of my snowmobile. The contact was brief, but unmistakable. A physical touch that sent vibrations through the machine's frame. I twisted around to look behind me, but my headlight only illuminated the path ahead. The darkness at my back remained complete and impenetrable. Whatever had touched my snowmobile was close enough to make physical contact while I was traveling at high speed. The implications of that made my hands shake on the handlebars. No earthly creature could match this kind of performance across Arctic terrain. No animal moved with such intelligence and persistence while remaining essentially invisible. 10 miles from the station, 11, 12. The GPS showed I was more than halfway to Coldwater, but the presence tracking me showed no signs of fatigue or decreased interest. If anything, it seemed to be getting more aggressive as we neared civilization. The glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision became more frequent and bold, and I could feel something large moving just outside my light beam with increasing urgency. The town's glow appeared on the horizon at 13 miles, a faint amber smudge against the black sky that represented warmth, safety, and normal human existence. Street lights and house windows, people going about their evening routines, electric heating and stocked refrigerators. Everything the research station had stripped away. The presence seemed to notice the distant lights too. Its behavior changed immediately, becoming more frantic and aggressive. Movement flickered constantly at the edges of my vision now, and I could hear sounds beneath the snowmobile's engine roar. Not animal calls or natural noises, but something that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest cavity, just like the howling I'd heard on my first night. 14 miles. The town's lights grew brighter and more distinct. Individual street lamps became visible, along with the warm yellow glow of windows and the organized geometry of roads and buildings. Normal civilization, governed by normal rules where mysterious creatures didn't pursue people across frozen wastelands. At 14.5 miles, Just as the first detailed shapes of Coldwater became visible in my headlight beam, something massive brushed against the side of my snowmobile. The contact was forceful enough to knock me sideways, sending the machine into a skidding slide across the icy surface. I fought to regain control, pulling hard on the handlebars as the snowmobile threatened to tip over completely. For several terrifying seconds, I was sliding sideways at high speed with no traction and no control over my direction. The machine straightened out just as the first streetlight came into clear view ahead of me. Behind me, I felt rather than saw the presence pull back into the darkness, its attention withdrawing like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. Whatever had been tracking me across 12 miles of Arctic wilderness had stopped pursuing me the moment civilization became real rather than distant. The snowmobile's engine coughed and died as I coasted into the parking lot outside Mel's 24-hour diner, the only building in Coldwater showing signs of life at 2 a.m. Neon beer signs flickered in the windows, and warm yellow light spilled across the snow-covered asphalt. The contrast between this ordinary scene and the nightmare I had just escaped felt so stark it made my head spin. I sat on the motionless snowmobile for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled and watching the empty street beyond the diner. Nothing moved in the shadows between streetlights. No massive shapes tracked my position from the darkness. My legs shook when I finally stood up. Whether from the extreme cold or adrenaline, I couldn't tell. Every exposed inch of skin burned from the wind chill, and my face mask had frozen to my beard with accumulated moisture from my breathing. I left the snowmobile where it sat and stumbled toward the diner's entrance, desperate for warmth and human contact after hours of being hunted through absolute darkness. The bell above the door chimed as I pushed inside, and a wave of heated air hit me like a physical embrace. The interior looked exactly like every small-town diner I'd ever seen. Vinyl booths, checkerboard floors, and the smell of coffee that had been brewing since the previous afternoon. A middle-aged waitress with graying hair looked up from wiping down the counter, taking in my heavy winter gear and probably the wild expression I couldn't hide. "Rough night out there, hun?" I pulled off my face mask and tried to form words that would make sense to someone who lived in a normal world where creatures didn't stalk people across frozen landscapes. Equipment problems at the research station, had to get back to town. She nodded as if late-night arrivals from the station were routine rather than extraordinary. I found an empty booth near the window where I could watch the parking lot and see anyone or anything approaching the building. The waitress brought me coffee without being asked, the ceramic mug warming my hands through my gloves. "You'll want to use the phone," she said, pointing toward an old payphone mounted on the wall near the restrooms. "Most folks who come in from that place need to make some calls." The casual way she said it made me look up from my coffee. Most folks who come in from that place. As if researchers fleeing the station in the middle of the night was a regular occurrence rather than an isolated incident. "Does this happen often?" "Every few months someone shows up looking exactly like you do right now. Scared, cold, won't say much about what happened out there." She refilled my coffee cup, even though I'd barely touched it. "Most of them just want to arrange transport out of town as fast as possible." The implications of her words sank in slowly. Other researchers had made the same desperate journey I'd just completed. Other people had discovered that the station's rules weren't paranoid restrictions, but necessary survival protocols. Other rational, scientifically trained individuals had encountered something that shattered their understanding of what was possible in the world. I walked to the payphone and called Dr. Peterson, my department supervisor at the university. The conversation would be tricky. I needed to provide a plausible explanation for abandoning my research assignment without mentioning supernatural encounters that would destroy my academic credibility. The phone rang 4 times before Peterson's groggy voice answered. "Daniel, do you have any idea what time it is?" "I'm sorry to wake you, but I'm having serious equipment failures at the station. The atmospheric monitoring gear is completely malfunctioning, and the heating system is showing signs of breakdown." The lies came easier than I'd expected. probably because they felt less insane than the truth. I don't think I can complete the research objectives under these conditions. Peterson was quiet for several moments, processing my request to terminate the assignment early. Are you saying you want to come back? I'm saying I need to come back. The equipment problems are too extensive to fix in the field, and staying any longer would compromise data integrity. I kept my voice steady and professional, focusing on concerns that would resonate with academic priorities. I can arrange alternative atmospheric research locations that won't have these technical limitations. What about the station supervisor? What does he say about the equipment problems? The question caught me off guard. How could I explain that David Miller had suggested I find other ways to leave while his eyes went completely blank? How could I describe Thomas Brown's catatonic episodes or Sarah Johnson's careful documentation of impossible supply discrepancies? Miller is dealing with multiple system failures. He agrees that continuing the research under current conditions would be unproductive. Another long pause as Peterson weighed the professional implications of a research assistant abandoning a prestigious assignment. All right, Daniel. Come back to Anchorage, and we'll discuss alternative arrangements for your research requirements. I hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved and guilty. The lies had protected my academic standing, but they also meant nobody would investigate what was really happening at that station. Future researchers would arrive unprepared, just as I had, expecting normal scientific work instead of a facility governed by rules designed to keep impossible things at bay. I returned to my booth and spent the next several hours watching the parking lot through the diner's windows. Cars passed occasionally on the main street, their headlights sweeping across normal suburban terrain. A police cruiser made 2 routine patrols, the officer waving at the waitress through the glass. A delivery truck stopped at the gas station across the street, and the driver went inside to pay for fuel and buy coffee. Everything was completely, reassuringly ordinary. No massive shapes moved between the streetlights. No unexplained sounds carried across the quiet town. Whatever ruled the darkness around the research station couldn't or wouldn't operate in populated areas. The waitress refreshed my coffee several more times without comment, occasionally glancing out the window as if she understood what I was watching for. Around 4:30, she sat down across from me in the booth. There's a transport service that runs to Anchorage. Owner gets up early and he's used to emergency runs from the station. She slid a business card across the table. Arctic Express Transportation with a phone number and address in town. He'll be awake in about an hour if you want to arrange pickup. I studied the card, noting it was worn smooth from frequent handling. How many other researchers had received the same recommendation? How many people had fled that station and needed immediate transport away from the area? Thank you. This is exactly what I need. She nodded and returned to her work behind the counter, leaving me alone with my coffee and the growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much larger than a single isolated incident. The station's influence had been claiming people for years, and the local community had developed informal support systems for those who managed to escape. Dawn came gradually, gray light replacing the artificial illumination of streetlights. I watched the town wake up around me. People heading to work, children waiting for school buses, dogs being walked on normal suburban streets. The mundane activities felt almost surreal after the supernatural horror I'd experienced just hours earlier. At 6 o'clock, I called Arctic Express Transportation. The owner, a practical-sounding man named Frank, agreed to pick me up at the diner within the hour. No questions about why I needed emergency transport or what had happened to bring me to town in the middle of the night. Apparently, requests like mine were routine enough that explanations weren't necessary. Frank arrived in a heavy-duty pickup truck equipped with tire chains and emergency gear. He looked like someone who'd spent decades dealing with Arctic conditions and probably unusual passengers. While he loaded my minimal belongings into the truck bed, I took one last look at the snowmobile I'd abandoned in the parking lot. Someone will deal with that, Frank said, following my gaze. Station equipment always gets returned eventually. The drive to Anchorage took 3 hours across highways that felt impossibly normal after my desperate flight through the wilderness. Frank maintained polite conversation about weather conditions and road maintenance, carefully avoiding any questions about my research work or reasons for leaving. His discretion felt practiced, as if he'd transported many people who needed to get away from the station without discussing what they'd experienced there. At the Anchorage airport, I purchased the first available flight to Seattle, then on to my home university. As the plane taxied down the runway, I pressed my face against the small window and looked down at the vast white expanse of Alaska's interior. Somewhere in that endless landscape, David Miller, Sarah Johnson, and Thomas Brown were still following their nightly routines, still checking window coverings and monitoring supply inventories, still maintaining the rules that kept something unimaginable at bay. The rules I'd dismissed as paranoid nonsense during my first day at the station. The rules that had seemed like the products of isolation psychology in extreme weather conditions. The rules that were actually a survival manual for coexisting with something that existed outside the boundaries of scientific explanation. As the plane gained altitude and the white landscape disappeared beneath cloud cover, I pulled out my notebook and carefully wrote down each rule exactly as David Miller had presented them to me. Not because I planned to return to that place, but because I finally understood that some knowledge came with a price too dangerous to pay. The rules weren't restrictions. They were the only thing standing between human reason and something that could shatter it completely. I never filed an official report about what really happened at the research station. Nobody would have believed me. And more importantly, trying to explain it would have meant risking my sanity by dwelling on experiences that had no place in a rational world. Instead, I focused on completing my graduate degree, using data from conventional research locations, where the only variables were atmospheric pressure and wind patterns. But I kept those rules written in my notebook, a reminder that the universe contained mysteries that were better left uninvestigated. Some doors should remain closed, some questions should stay unasked, and some places were dangerous not because of what they lacked, but because of what they contained.